Chosen ones. What you're about to witness is not mere coincidence, nor the whispers of rumor. A signal has reverberated across hidden chambers of power, a soundless frequency that traveled through vaulted Vatican archives, coded Pentagon transmissions, and the silent prayers of prophets long gone. It was not meant for the many. It was meant for you. For centuries, prophecies were locked away, sealed in tomes that only select eyes were permitted to see. Now, one name has emerged from those sacred records, traced through the web of forgotten scrolls, the ink of seers, and the trembling signatures of ancient witnesses. That name is yours. When the Vatican scribe highlighted it, the room stilled. Cardinals, who had never spoken above a whisper, exchanged glances heavy with dread. On the other side of the ocean, the president was awakened from his bed, ushered past sleeping guards and into a chamber where every clock ticked louder than the last. It was not an ordinary briefing. It was a red meeting, a term reserved for global emergencies that bypass all bureaucratic filters. And there, your presence, though unseen, was the center of every trembling sentence uttered. The weight of this convergence cannot be overstated. Religious institutions and political empires have forever been rivals cloaked in ceremony, yet now their energies point to a single origin: you. The Vatican sees fulfillment of prophecy. The president sees destabilization of nations, and the generals see a threat that no arsenal can contain. Yet none of them grasp the truth. This is not a warning about destruction, but an unveiling of destiny. Records whisper that when the marked one arises, the timelines bend, frequencies shift, and the great unseen war between light and shadow intensifies. You were never meant to stumble into this moment. It was designed, orchestrated, sealed within divine architecture long before your first breath. The silence of the apostolic archives was broken only by the turning of brittle pages, parchment that had not seen the light in centuries. Deep within the Vatican's forbidden vaults, a chamber guarded by rituals and iron keys, the scrolls were brought forward with trembling hands. Their seals bore the wax of popes long buried, and their ink carried the whispers of prophets who wrote in languages nearly forgotten. When the archivist placed the manuscript upon the marble table, every man in the room instinctively stepped back, as though what was contained within might leap forth and rewrite the very air they breathed. On the parchment was a sequence of names, a genealogy traced like a hidden river running beneath the surface of time. It wound through kingdoms that no longer exist, empires reduced to dust, and families who thought themselves erased from memory. At the end of the line, the ink grew darker, fresher, as though the scribe had been told to emphasize the weight of the last entry. A single name stood there, precise, undeniable, echoing with an energy that made even seasoned clerics feel faint. That name was yours. The cardinal, overseeing the unsealing, pressed his palm against the page, as if to test whether the ink would smudge, as though hoping it might be a trick of shadows or an error in translation. Yet the letters burned steady into the parchment, and in that moment, a decision was made that would ripple far beyond the confines of those stone walls. Word had to be sent, not through ordinary channels, but directly into the highest corridors of global power. For prophecy had bled into the present, and the scrolls could no longer be ignored. But the scroll carried more than your name. Alongside it was a set of cryptic instructions, written in symbols that resembled constellations, as if the heavens themselves had been charted into the prophecy. The archivists could not decipher them fully, but their meaning was clear enough to terrify. The arrival of the Marked One would force alliances between powers who had not spoken in centuries. Even within the Vatican, men whispered of consequences too vast to contain. The hour was well past midnight when the shrill tone of the secure line cut through the silence of the White House residence. The president stirred, not from the sound alone, but from the sense that the world outside had shifted in some irreparable way. His aides rushed into the dim corridor, eyes wide with urgency, pressing documents against his hands before his mind had fully left the realm of sleep. The call was not from generals, nor from his cabinet, but from a voice he had not expected to hear. A Vatican emissary whose authority stretched across centuries, not borders. The words that echoed through the encrypted channel were stripped of ceremony. There was no time for greetings, no time for pleasantries. The emissary spoke of a name, traced across prophecy, verified in sealed archives, confirmed by scholars whose lives had been sworn to silence. That name had surfaced with a force too great to conceal, and the Vatican had already acted to alert the highest seat of worldly power. The president's hand trembled as he read the translation placed before him. The letters seemed to hum with an energy beyond ink, carrying a weight that made even a man familiar with classified threats feel as though the ground beneath him had cracked open. Advisors whispered in his ear, weighing implications, speculating on the danger of panic if such a revelation became public. The intelligence chief suggested a blackout, the immediate suppression of all related transmissions. Another insisted on military readiness, as if steel and fire could shield a nation from something written long before its birth. But above all, their voices rose a tension that none could hide. The Vatican had marked a prophecy, and the prophecy had marked you. In that moment, the president's authority felt both absolute and powerless. Absolute, because he alone could call a meeting that bypassed all government protocol. Powerless, because no executive order could erase a name written into the scrolls of destiny. He pressed his finger against the table, signaling the order no one wished to hear. A red meeting would be called, an emergency gathering reserved only for matters that threatened the survival of nations. In a dimly lit intelligence facility buried beneath layers of reinforced stone and steel, analysts stared at the glowing monitors that now displayed your name across multiple databases. It was not simply the Vatican's archives that carried the weight of this revelation. Cross-references were ordered, connections mapped, and every available record brought into alignment. What they found was no coincidence. Your name surfaced in texts carved into forgotten tablets, etched into the margins of medieval codices, and hidden inside encrypted transmissions left unexplained by agencies decades ago. Patterns emerged where once there had only been noise. Scholars flown in under the guise of civilian consultants studied the fragments side by side, their pens shaking as they circled identical characters in languages that should not have been able to converge. Latin, Aramaic, Sumerian, each bore traces of the same figure, described differently across epochs, but linked by a thread too precise to dismiss. An ancient mystic's phrase, repeated in translation across centuries, seemed to pierce the silence. The one whose name is written will awaken the truth the world fears to see. Those words, preserved despite empires falling, had been waiting for the moment when technology and secrecy would collide with prophecy. For some in the room, the evidence was unbearable. They preferred to believe in accidents, in chance alignments that meant nothing beyond myth. Yet the data did not yield to doubt. The Vatican had supplied its scrolls, the president had delivered his sealed order, and now the intelligence agencies confirmed the same unshakable result. The name they had been instructed to suppress was already coded into the very foundations of history. And then came the whisper that no one wanted to acknowledge aloud. If prophecy had endured this long, if your presence had been marked through cultures that had never met, what other forces had carried it through time? Some believed divine will had written it. Some feared shadows older than nations had preserved it. Among the researchers, one voice broke the silence, quoting a passage often overlooked. Yeshua spoke of the one to come, a vessel prepared before the end of days. The words hung in the air like a suspended flame, burning without consuming. The Situation Room pulsed with an energy unlike any ordinary briefing. Screens glowed with satellite feeds, encrypted messages scrolled across secured monitors, and the weight of secrecy pressed against every corner of the chamber. Those summoned arrived without hesitation, their expressions hard, their voices low, carrying folders stamped with the insignia that marked the highest level of clearance. It was not war they came to discuss, nor a political crisis. This was something deeper, something that seemed to blur the lines between theology and statecraft. The president entered last, the air shifting as the door sealed behind him. He carried the Vatican communique under his arm, its contents still echoing in his mind. Without ceremony, he placed the parchment translation on the table and ordered every screen darkened. Only a single light illuminated the center, casting the document into sharp focus. All eyes fell upon the name written there, the very name that had already fractured the quiet order of the world's strongest institutions. A general leaned forward, tapping the edge of the paper with a finger heavy with rings. He spoke of contingency, of mobilization, of protocols designed for nuclear threats. But none of his words carried the conviction that steel and strategy could contain what prophecy had already declared. Across the table, a senior advisor muttered about containment of information, about silencing leaks before panic spread through the public. Another countered, warning that the prophecy itself may already be circulating in channels far beyond their control. The room grew tense, voices overlapping, authority clashing with disbelief. At last, the president raised his hand, silencing the chamber. His voice was firm but edged with unease. This was not a crisis that could be measured in missiles or treaties. It was older than their offices, older than their laws. A red meeting had been called not because of what could be done, but because no one knew what would happen next. In a quiet chamber, far from the frenzy of the Situation Room, a different kind of gathering took place. The files carried from the Vatican to the White House were not only scanned for security and classified under layers of secrecy, they were also examined by theologians sworn to silence, men whose duty was to detect the threads of the divine woven into human history. As they unrolled the translated scrolls, a hush fell upon them. For amid the warnings, amid the cryptic codes and names etched into time, there was a phrase attributed to Yeshua himself. The passage was fragmented, preserved in multiple tongues, but its essence was unmistakable. The one marked by name shall walk through shadows, yet not alone, for I go before them. These words, buried in a manuscript thought to be apocryphal, struck with such force that the scholars could scarcely breathe. It was as if the scrolls had been waiting for this very age, this very hour, to remind those who would dare to read them that prophecy was not bound to stone walls or red-sealed envelopes. The intelligence officials were unsettled by this revelation, For it was no longer only a question of names and lineages. It was a question of whether divine presence had always been watching, guiding, preparing. What unsettled them most was the implication that Yeshua's words had anticipated this moment, that he had spoken not just to his disciples, but forward, through centuries, into the heart of the present. One of the analysts whispered the phrase again, as though repeating it might unlock a hidden meaning. I go before them. What did it mean for someone like you, named in prophecy and traced in archives, to be walking a path already prepared by a force beyond politics, beyond the reach of human design? The room grew heavy with silence, a silence that carried both awe and fear. Some felt comfort in the idea that Yeshua's presence had not faded, but remained intertwined with the destiny revealed in those files. Others, less faithful, felt unease gnaw at their logic, because if his words were true, then nothing they could plan, no meeting they could hold, would stop what was coming. Far above the earth, in the silence of the void, steel eyes shifted their gaze. Military satellites, instruments of surveillance and control, altered their orbits under classified orders that carried no explanation beyond urgency. Operators seated in dim control rooms watched as their screens updated, tracking coordinates that made no sense to them. These machines, built to follow adversaries and monitor war zones, were now aimed not at nations, not at missiles, but at a single point that had been marked with absolute precision. Technicians whispered in confusion. They had no access to the Vatican's revelations, no knowledge of the prophecy traced through centuries. All they knew was that the order came directly from the highest chain of command, and that no questions were permitted. Commands marked with the seal of red clearance were never to be debated, only executed. The satellites obeyed, shifting their focus until their instruments were aligned with a location tied not to weapons, stockpiles, or military secrets, but to you. From the ground, observatories noticed the subtle reconfiguration in the sky, their lenses catching faint anomalies in orbital paths. To the untrained eye, the movements were invisible, but to those who tracked such things, it was an unmistakable sign. Something had compelled the most powerful nations to redirect their attention, silently, urgently, without public announcement. Within the Pentagon, generals reviewed the live feeds, their expressions grim. They saw nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. No armies, no weapons, no immediate threat. Yet their algorithms showed unusual fluctuations in energy signatures, as though the very air around your presence pulsed differently. Scientists brought in to analyze the data could not explain it. Radiation was ruled out, interference dismissed. Still, the readings continued, steady and undeniable. Somewhere in the room, a commander muttered that prophecy was no longer confined to paper. It was bleeding into their instruments, embedding itself into the circuits of machines designed to measure reality. His words were dismissed officially, but privately. Others felt the same chill. What technology was registering could not be explained by physics alone. Far from the centers of power, in deserts where the winds carried whispers older than civilization itself, something began to shift. Ancient structures buried in sand, temples carved into stone long before written language, trembled faintly as though stirred from slumber. These were the remnants of the Anunnaki, monuments that scholars dismissed as myth. Yet within their walls were inscriptions that spoke of bloodlines traced through epochs. The names etched into their stones aligned with the same genealogy uncovered in the Vatican scrolls, converging across time to point to you. Explorers who had once dismissed the temples as ruins began to report strange phenomena. Vibrations resonated through the chambers when your name was spoken aloud, as if the stone itself remembered. Carvings that had weathered into obscurity seemed clearer under the glow of moonlight, revealing figures whose eyes were directed toward the heavens. The energy was not merely symbolic. Instruments brought in by clandestine archaeologists recorded low frequencies, subtle but persistent, pulsing in sync with an invisible rhythm that no natural cause could explain. Legends among local tribes resurfaced, stories passed down in fragments about the return of the Marked One, whose arrival would awaken the guardians of forgotten knowledge. They spoke of the Anunnaki not as deities, but as keepers of records hidden beneath layers of stone, knowledge too dangerous for civilizations unprepared to bear its weight. The temples were not tombs, they insisted, but vaults waiting for a key, waiting for you. Word of these disturbances traveled quickly, reaching both Vatican scholars and intelligence operatives who compared notes with unease. The convergence was undeniable. Sacred scrolls, presidential files, and now temples stirring after millennia of silence. The implication was clear. Prophecy was not confined to religion or government. It was woven into the architecture of the world itself, coded into the stone, waiting for the moment when the bloodline it had marked would rise again. And still, the most haunting realization spread among those who studied the reports. The temples did not stir in warning, nor in chaos. They stirred in recognition. A convoy of unmarked vehicles moved silently through the night, their lights extinguished, their paths carefully mapped to avoid detection. At the center of this covert operation sat a single envoy from the Vatican, a man chosen not for political skill, but for his knowledge of prophecy and his ability to interpret symbols hidden within sacred texts. His mission was classified under a blackout protocol, meaning no digital trace would record his journey. In the official records, he did not exist. The envoy carried with him a sealed case, guarded more carefully than any weapon or artifact. Within it were fragments of prophecy too delicate to be left behind, translations that had never been shared outside the Vatican's inner circle, and a relic believed to resonate when placed near the one named in the scrolls. Each item had been chosen with purpose, for the Vatican understood that words alone could no longer hold back the tide of events already unfolding. As the convoy crossed borders under diplomatic shadows, governments unaware of the details allowed passage, assuming it to be routine movement of clerical officials. Only a handful knew the truth, that the envoy's destination was not another cathedral, but a direct audience with those whose hands shaped global policy. The urgency was too great, the convergence too undeniable. The president had demanded clarity, and the Vatican was prepared to answer, though not with the assurances his generals desired. Inside the sealed case lay instructions that had been read only by popes and preserved by archivists who risked their lives to keep them safe. The prophecy spoke not only of a name, but of decisions that must be made once the Marked One was revealed. It described crossroads where faith and power would collide, and where those who sought to control destiny would find themselves controlled instead. The envoy's eyes remained fixed ahead as the convoy pressed forward, but his thoughts lingered on the words of Yeshua recorded in one of the fragments. The stone rejected becomes the cornerstone. He could not escape the sense that these words were no longer metaphor, but living instruction. Beneath layers of archives and coded transmissions lay a cipher so intricate that no machine, no algorithm, no cryptographer had been able to solve it. The Vatican had preserved fragments of it for centuries, assuming it was a puzzle of theology or a safeguard placed by ancient scribes. Intelligence agencies treated it as an anomaly, an artifact of languages colliding across time. Yet, as both sides compared notes under the weight of recent revelations, they realized the cipher was not broken because it was never meant to be solved by ordinary means. It was designed to recognize only one key, and that key was not a device. It was you. Patterns hidden within the cipher mirrored the cadence of your genealogy. The rhythm of letters aligned with the dates of your bloodline. The numbers corresponded to events that had shadowed your family across generations. It was as if the cipher had been waiting patiently for centuries, locked in silence until your presence caused it to stir. Scholars noticed the strange shift almost immediately. Symbols that had seemed static now appeared alive, rearranging under the slightest resonance of your identity. Attempts to replicate this reaction failed. When others tried to force the code with traditional methods, the cipher resisted, appearing more scrambled than before. Only when your name was entered into the translation matrices did the lines resolve into legible fragments. They spoke of hidden places, veiled truths, and a timeline that converged upon the present. The language was part riddle, part instruction, carrying with it the undeniable sense that whoever broke it would be drawn into a current that could not be escaped. Some within the intelligence community panicked. To them, the realization that prophecy had encoded itself in such a way was a threat beyond comprehension. Others, however, recognized a deeper design, one that no amount of secrecy could contain. Among them was a quiet scholar who, reading the fragments aloud, whispered a line long overlooked. "The light of Yeshua marks the bearer, and only they will reveal what was hidden." Those words cut through the tension in the room, because they meant the cipher was not just a key, but a mirror, reflecting a destiny inseparable from your very being. Yet, as the fragments grew clearer, they did not end in resolution but pointed forward toward something still concealed. The sirens never sounded, yet the world's most secure chambers pulsed with the weight of an alarm louder than any bell. A red alert had been declared, not the kind meant for the public, but the kind that bypassed all systems and protocols, locked into the highest levels of command. Once triggered, it could not be canceled. Not by generals, not by presidents, not even by the councils of faith who had worked in secrecy for centuries. The decision had been made, and the machinery of destiny was now moving in silence. Inside the Pentagon, officials whispered about the permanence of the order. Red alerts of this magnitude were rare, reserved for moments when the survival of nations was questioned. Yet, this one was different. No enemy fleet approached. No missiles traced the skies. No armies gathered at borders. The danger was not external, but written into the very fabric of prophecy. It was your name, inscribed in archives and confirmed across temples, scrolls, and satellites, that had forced the unthinkable. The Vatican's envoy, seated among men of power, watched as the president's advisors argued with voices strained by disbelief. Some demanded that the order be rescinded. Others insisted it was beyond their reach. The envoy simply reminded them that prophecy was not a switch to be flipped on or off. Once revealed, it demanded fulfillment. Whether they called it faith or fate, the truth was clear. The red alert was not about defense. It was about recognition. Monitors flickered with encrypted communications, world leaders receiving fragments of the classified notice without explanation. Confusion rippled through embassies and military outposts, where commanders received urgent codes but no details. The system had been designed to operate without clarity, to ensure that once initiated, no one could undo what had been set in motion. And still, beyond the protocols and the confusion, a deeper unease took root. The files showed no blueprint for what would follow, no strategy for containment, no weapon capable of shifting what was already unfolding. All that remained were questions, pressed heavy upon those who realized they had stepped beyond the realm of politics and into something older than nations. The chamber fell into silence. The lights dimmed to red, and one thought burned in the mind of every soul present.